The sun had barely risen over Muroc Dry Lake when the silence split apart. A single crack rolled across the desert, sharp, violent, unnatural. Mechanics jerked their heads up from tool benches. Pilots froze mid-stride, leaving the mess tent. Even the base dogs stopped and stared at the sky. Everyone assumed it was another bomb test. Nothing else made a sound like that. Then a metallic glint appeared high above the shimmering haze. At first glance, it looked like a P-38 diving far too steep, far too fast. But the silhouette didn't match any aircraft on the base. The wings were too narrow, the nose too pointed, and instead of propeller wash, a streak of shimmering heat trailed behind it. Whatever it wasn't using pistons or props. It was something no one at Muroc had ever seen flying under an American star. The craft plummeted downward in a near-vertical dive, the air around it screaming like metal under torture. It should have disintegrated. It didn't. At the last possible second, just feet above the cracked lake bed, the mystery aircraft leveled out. A wall of dust exploded behind it as it tore across the flats, skimming so low the shockwave toppled tool carts and sent hats tumbling through the air. Men dove for cover. A lieutenant shouted, "That's no aircraft we have!" Someone else yelled back, "Then who the hell does it belong to?" No one had an answer. All they saw was a silver blur bending the air into rippling waves, then disappearing behind a ridge of dunes with a roar that echoed long after the machine itself had vanished. A jeep tore out across the lake bed toward the settling dust. Everyone expected to find wreckage, twisted aluminum, scattered engine parts, maybe a crater. Instead, they found something impossible, a battered cockpit assembled from mismatched components, its panels scorched black and its seams showing the unmistakable uneven lines of hand-welded metal. Crawling out of the smoking fuselage was Staff Sergeant Elias Grant, the mechanic known more for improvisation than discipline. His goggles were cracked, his sleeves were half burned, his face was smeared with soot. But he was laughing. A low, breathless laugh, like a man who had just gambled with death and won. One of the mechanics ran up to him. "Grant, what did you do?" He wiped the dust from his eyes and answered with a grin that unsettled everyone who saw it. "I think I pushed her faster than the air wanted to let me." None of them yet understood what that meant. They didn't know every instrument needle in the tower had bent from the spike. They didn't know the shockwave they heard was the signature of a barrier no American aircraft had ever crossed. They didn't know Grant had just broken the sound barrier in 1944. With a jet built from scrap. All they knew was the air had cracked open, and the future had arrived early. In 1944, every pilot on the base believed the same story. America was behind. Behind Germany's Me-262. Behind Britain's Meteor. Behind the future. The newspapers said it. The training films said it. Even the brass repeated it like a prayer. Jets are too unstable, too unreliable, too dangerous to field. The message was clear. The United States wasn't ready. That belief shaped everything at Muroc. Hangar chiefs grumbled about turbojets that failed after 20 hours. Test pilots joked that the XP-59 needed divine intervention just to reach takeoff speed. Engineers complained about funding delays, missing parts, and Washington committees who feared headlines more than breakthroughs. The entire jet program felt like a fragile experiment the Air Force tolerated, not embraced. So the idea of a homemade jet, built by a mechanic, not a laboratory one, was a punchline. Every branch had a version of the joke. You want a jet? Ask Berlin. You want it to explode? Ask Washington. You want it to never fly? Ask procurement. In that atmosphere, Elias Grant's obsession wasn't just unusual. It was heresy. The misconception ran deeper than morale. American doctrine itself insisted that innovation belonged in controlled environments. Wind tunnels, university labs, corporate research centers. Experiments required signatures, safety boards, and months of paperwork. Creativity was measured in foot-pounds and clearance levels. A mechanic's job was simple. Fix what exists. Do not imagine what could. Grant rejected that idea completely. He didn't see the United States as behind. He saw it as hesitating. The technology was there, scattered across scrap piles, abandoned prototypes, and discarded test parts. The problem wasn't capability, it was caution, and caution wouldn't win a jet race already moving at the speed of fear. Other nations weren't waiting. Germany had jets in combat. Britain had jets in formation. Japan was experimenting with rocket interceptors. Meanwhile, America kept grounding its prototypes for safety reviews. The misconception that slow, careful steps were the only responsible path became a self-inflicted wound, a wound Grant was unwilling to live with. To him, the future wasn't something to observe from behind a chalkboard. It was something to seize with his own hands, wrench by wrench, weld by weld. When he looked at the failed engines and abandoned turbines scattered around the test site, he didn't see broken machinery. He saw pieces of a puzzle no one else was trying to complete. The men who mocked him believed the myth. Grant didn't. And that single difference, belief versus hesitation, would decide who touched the next era of flight first. Elias Grant grew up on the flat plains of western Kansas, where wind ruled everything. Out there, you didn't learn machines from manuals. You learned them from survival. His family farm had equipment older than he was, half-rusted and always threatening to die in the middle of harvest. His father taught him early. A mechanic who waits for parts starves. A mechanic who improvises eats. Grant took that lesson to heart. By 14, he could rebuild a tractor engine with nothing but fencing wire, scrap metal, and whatever bolts he could steal off broken plows. School never interested him. Engines did. Airflow did. Pressure differentials fascinated him before he ever knew the words for them. He loved watching storms roll across the fields, studying how wind curved around barns and silos. "The air speaks if you're quiet enough," he once told his mother. She laughed, but he meant it. When he enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1941, he expected a world overflowing with brilliant engineers, bleeding-edge machines, and the freedom to experiment. Instead, he found checklists, strict protocols, and officers who told him to stop asking weird questions. Grant respected rules, until they interfered with logic. And logic told him America's aviation future wasn't in propellers anymore. At Muroc, he was assigned to P-38 maintenance. It should have been routine work. Instead, it became a laboratory of frustration. Grant kept pointing out airflow inefficiencies in the intakes. The crew chief shrugged. He complained about the cooling system bleeding power at altitude. They told him to fill out a form. He asked why turbine scrap was being thrown away instead of studied. They told him to stay in his lane. But Grant couldn't. His brain wasn't built that way. He visited the scrapyard daily, studying every discarded compressor blade, every cracked turbine housing, memorizing the edges where metal failed. He hung around test hangars long after shifts ended, watching engineers pack up their notes, then sneaking in to study the failed prototypes they'd abandoned. He learned more from broken machinery than textbooks ever could have taught him. Soon, he developed a reputation. Some called him curious. Others called him reckless. A few whispered dangerous. The truth was simpler. Grant noticed things. He noticed how certain compressor geometries behaved better at high altitude. He noticed how P-38 intercoolers handled thermal load more efficiently than anyone realized. He noticed how the Army kept missing opportunities because it clung to procedures designed for a world before jets existed. And once he saw those connections, he couldn't unsee them. The officers believed the future of American aviation depended on universities, corporations, and high-clearance research teams. Grant believed the future was scattered across the floor of the junk shed, waiting for someone stubborn enough to put the pieces together. All he needed was time. All he needed was scrap. And all he needed was one moment when no one was watching, to begin building the machine that would change everything. By mid-1944, the United States had a problem no one wanted to say out loud. The jet age had begun, and America wasn't in it. Germany's Me-262 was already tearing through bomber formations. Britain's Gloucester Meteor was flying home defense. Even Japan was experimenting with rocket-powered interceptors that looked more like bullets than airplanes. Meanwhile, America's jet program consisted of prototypes that burned more fuel sitting on the runway than flying through the air. The numbers were brutal. The Army Air Forces had exactly 3 functional test jets, and none of them could maintain stable thrust for more than 22 hours before catastrophic turbine failure. Every redesign caused new problems. Every fix created a new weakness. It was an engineering nightmare strangled by bureaucracy. The XP-59 era Comet, America's first official jet, was the worst offender. On paper, it was revolutionary. In the air, it was a disappointment. Its thrust output maxed at 1,300 pounds. Force, barely enough to lift the aircraft without a downhill runway. Pilots joked it could be out-accelerated by an overweight P-40 with a bad hangover. During one test, the XP-59 fell behind a flock of pelicans. The birds won. Thermal inefficiency was another disaster. Early centrifugal engines overheated so quickly that the operating window between not enough thrust and exploding turbine was measured in seconds. Engineers calculated that, at best, the U.S. wouldn't have a reliable jet engine until late 1947. That meant American air power would remain stuck in the propeller era while enemies sprinted into the future. Adding to the crisis was supply chain reality. A wartime survey revealed that 70% of advanced engine components arrived late, incomplete, or out of tolerance. Precision machining was stretched thin. Tooling was behind schedule. Replacement parts for prototypes took months, not weeks. And without parts, prototypes stayed grounded. This wasn't an engineering slowdown. It was a systemic bottleneck. The bureaucratic logic was simple. If a design wasn't documented, signed, and stamped, it didn't exist. But the war didn't care about signatures. The Pacific didn't care about safety boards. Europe didn't care about protocol. America was losing time, and time was the only airspeed that mattered. Elias Grant saw the numbers every day. He studied scrap turbine blades worn thin by thermal cycling. He calculated pressure ratios by hand long after midnight. He watched engineers file reports instead of experimenting. He watched the future gathering dust in wooden crates marked "Do Not Touch." To Grant, the crisis wasn't a mystery. It was math, and math was merciless. If the United States didn't leap forward immediately, it would fall permanently behind. It didn't matter how good the P-51 was. It didn't matter how many B-17s America built. Propeller aircraft had reached their ceiling. The next war would be won above 30,000 feet by machines that could outrun the air itself. Grant wasn't trying to fix a broken system. He was trying to escape it. And soon, the war's most important machine would begin taking shape not in a laboratory, but under a tarp behind Hangar 6, assembled from scrap, sweat, and mathematics no one had authorized him to use. Elias Grant didn't set out to build a jet. He set out to solve a problem. But the more he tinkered with discarded parts, the more he realized the solution wasn't going to come from improving an existing design. It would come from creating something that wasn't supposed to exist at all. The decision happened quietly, in the dead hours of a desert night, with a single spark from a welding torch bouncing off a pile of condemned components. That spark became the first heartbeat of Grant's forbidden machine. The scrapyard behind Hangar 6 was the graveyard of American jet ambition. Broken compressor blades, cracked turbine housings, abandoned intake rings, bent P-38 intercoolers stacked like metal gravestones. To the Air Force, it was all junk. To Grant, it was opportunity. He scavenged pieces with the instincts of a surgeon choosing organs for a transplant, testing flex, inspecting stress lines, tapping metal with 2 fingers to hear its resonance. He didn't just want parts that fit. He wanted parts that wanted to work together. He began with the intake. Grant believed every U.S. prototype suffered from the same flaw. They treated airflow like something to be forced through a tube. He saw it as something to be guided like wind slipping along a canyon. Using discarded XP-59 intake rings and segments of P-40 ductwork, he built a hybrid, asymmetrical intake shaped to gently funnel pressure rather than slam it inward. No engineer had ever approved the shape. No manual supported it. Grant called it just listening to the air. Next came the compressor. He combined two centrifugal stages from cracked General Electric units, trimming the blades by hand and rebalancing them with a scale he built from fishing weights and a stolen machinist's gauge. It should have been impossible. Centrifugal compressors required precision machining measured in thousandths of an inch. Grant used a belt sander and intuition. Every time the compressor spun too rough, he took it apart again, shaved another fraction off a blade, and tried once more. After 17 failures and a near-fatal metal shard explosion, he finally achieved something extraordinary, a compressor that ran smoother than the factory-built unit it had come from. For the combustion chamber, he cannibalized 3 different prototypes, welding them into a Frankenstein cylinder with internal vanes angled by guesswork and airflow instinct. He added P-38 intercoolers into the design, not to cool the air but to stabilize thermal load. No one had ever tried that. No one ever would have been allowed to. But it worked. Temperature spikes evened out. Fuel flow smoothed. The chamber hummed instead of rattled. Then came the part that would have ended his career if anyone knew, the nozzle. Grant built a crude variable exhaust using the broken cowling of an XP-46 and a set of modified control cables. When he tested it the first time, the tail assembly glowed orange. The second time, it produced a burst of flame so violent it knocked him backward. He stared at the scorch mark on the hangar wall for a long moment and whispered, "Afterburner." He didn't know the term yet, but he had built one. By his 9th week of secret construction, the machine had a shape, sharp, predatory, almost alive. A fuselage of mismatched metal sheets welded with seams no inspection officer would ever approve. An engine with more banned components than legal ones. A cockpit stripped from a grounded P-59, bolted into place with parts pilfered from scrap bins. The base crew mocked him the first time they saw it. Grant's lawnmower. Grant's suicide sled. Grant's toaster with wings. But he didn't argue. He kept tightening bolts and polishing intake lips and adjusting the angle of his Frankenstein nozzle. Because he knew something they didn't. The air didn't care about rules. It only cared about design. And Grant had built something that felt right in the air. To the officers who eventually examined the wreckage, the jet made no sense. It looked like a crime scene built out of spare parts. Nothing was uniform, nothing matched, nothing followed accepted airflow doctrine. And yet, when engineers mapped the internals, they discovered something infuriating. The design worked because it ignored the rules, not despite it. The first breakthrough was the intake geometry. Instead of the tight, forceful compression systems American engineers favored, Grant used wide, gently tapering curves. On paper, they were inefficient. In reality, they created a smoother pressure gradient that prevented surge at high speeds. It was the same principle that made canyon winds howl predictably instead of violently. Grant had simply applied desert instincts to jet engineering. Then there was the compressor assembly. Traditional thinking demanded precision-machined blades with uniform tolerance. Grant's blades weren't uniform, and they weren't machined with professional tools, but they were balanced, perfectly. The small irregularities allowed micro-swirls that stabilized the pressure at high RPMs. It was messy science that shouldn't have worked, except it did. Because Grant wasn't optimizing for diagrams, he was optimizing for reality. The P-38 intercoolers were another anomaly. No one in official programs had tried integrating them into jet systems. The theory said they couldn't withstand the heat. Grant didn't care about theory. He cared about metal behavior. The intercoolers absorbed thermal spikes and allowed the engine to run hotter without melting itself. That single change expanded the jet's operating window by nearly 30%. It was the difference between stalling at altitude and roaring through it. But the true miracle, the element that shocked every engineer who saw it, was the nozzle. Grant's makeshift variable exhaust acted like a crude afterburner. injecting raw fuel into the hot stream and producing short bursts of thrust far beyond what any American engine had achieved in 1944. When the nozzle opened at the exact moment during a high-speed dive, the extra thrust didn't just increase speed. It pushed the aircraft into a region where control surfaces thinned, the air stiffened, and every textbook said flight became impossible. The aircraft survived that region because of one last accident of genius: the fuselage. Its mismatched metal sheets created uneven flex zones that absorbed shock instead of fracturing. Where a perfectly symmetrical jet might have snapped, Grant's crooked seams acted like springs. The officers called it luck. The engineers called it dangerous. But anyone who understood airflow saw the truth. The jet flew because Grant built it with instinct no classroom could teach. He wasn't fighting physics. He was cooperating with it. And physics rewarded him. The morning Grant chose to test his creation wasn't tactical. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't even recorded on the hangar log. The only reason anyone knows what happened is because 3 crew chiefs smoking behind a fuel truck swore under oath that they watched a damn science experiment grow wings. Grant rolled the jet onto the tarmac just as the horizon slipped from deep purple to the pale gold of early dawn. The air was cold, good for engine density, and the desert wind lay flat like a sheet of glass. Perfect conditions. Dangerous conditions. Conditions that whispered go to any pilot reckless enough to listen. He didn't wear a flight suit, no parachute, no radio, just a leather jacket stitched 6 times over and a pair of goggles that had survived more crashes than the average lieutenant. When a crewman jogged over and asked, "Sir, authorization?" Grant simply pointed to the sky and said, "That's my authorization." Most men would have done a slow taxi, a systems check, a 5-minute idle to watch for temperature spikes. Grant didn't bother. He primed the fuel line manually because none of the gauges were calibrated and hit the ignition. The engine didn't start. It detonated. A sharp thunder crack rang across the airfield, sending a shock of heat over the ground. Mechanics dove for cover, certain the thing was about to tear itself apart. But instead of exploding, the jet settled into a guttural metallic growl. Vibrations rolled through the fuselage like a beast pacing inside a cage. Grant grinned. "Told you," he muttered, though no one could hear. He shoved the throttle forward. The jet lurched like it had been kicked by a mule, skidding sideways before the tires caught and the nose straightened. The acceleration was instant, violent, animalistic. One witness compared it to a bronco breaking out of a corral, wild, explosive, refusing to be controlled. Halfway down the runway, the engine surged. Flames blossomed from the tail like a comet had struck the earth. The improvised afterburner kicked in early, too early by any reasonable metric. But Grant didn't pull back. He pushed harder. The jet lifted, not gracefully, not smoothly. It clawed its way upward, wobbling as the mismatched fuselage met the sharp morning air. But wobble or not, it flew. Against every expectation, against every regulation, against every engineer who said his math belonged in the trash. At 1,000 feet, the jet steadied. At 3,000, it began to accelerate. The sound it made wasn't the whistle of a P-38 or the rumble of a P-47. It was a ripping, tearing shriek, as if the air was being sliced open. Pilots on the ground watched in stunned silence. One later said, "It didn't climb like a plane, it climbed like anger." Grant tested control surfaces. They responded late, but they responded. He rolled right, clean, rolled left, rough, but stable. Then he pointed the nose up and opened the throttle to its last notch. The jet leapt. Temperature spiked. The intercoolers screamed. The airframe shook hard enough to rattle his teeth. But it kept climbing. Higher, faster, into air so thin that piston fighters struggled, into a region that Allied aircraft simply did not reach. At 28,000 feet, the afterburner ignited again, and the jet kept going. Back on the ground, someone whispered a sentence that spread across the base like wildfire. "He's flying something the future hasn't built yet." Grant didn't hear it. He was too busy hanging onto a miracle. At 30,000 feet, the world narrows into shades of silver and blue. Air thins, engines gasp, props lose bite. Even the legendary Mustangs and Lightnings flatten out, clawing desperately for the last scraps of performance. Up here, physics holds the high ground. Grant's jet didn't care. As the altimeter ticked past the point where U.S. fighters normally began to wheeze, the homemade machine behaved like it had just woken up. The vibrations smoothed. The tail stopped shuddering. The improvised compressor blades, filed by hand, balanced by feel, and rejected a dozen times by official procurement, found their perfect RPM. The jet wasn't fighting the sky. It was slicing it. Grant pushed the throttle forward inch by inch, testing the Frankenstein of steel, scrap metal, and forbidden engineering he'd stitched together. Each movement came with a cost. Temperatures spiked. Pressure jumps rattled the cockpit. Warning lights he'd never wired blinked on and off like nervous fireflies. But the machine kept accelerating. At 420 mph, Grant expected the nose to wander. It didn't. At 460 mph, he expected the fuselage to twist. It didn't. At 500 mph, he expected the engine to combust. It didn't. Instead, the jet surged like it had more to give. Grant leaned forward, the desert sun blazing off the canopy, and muttered the kind of line only a man alone with a miracle could say, "Don't you dare stop now." The jet didn't. Down on the ground, binoculars tracked a streak carving through the morning sky. Pilots watching couldn't believe the rate of climb. One swore it looked like a bullet skipping across God's own table. Another dropped his coffee when the contrail angled nearly vertical. The crew chief, who hated Grant's ideas the most, spoke the quietest. "That's not possible." But it was happening. Grant leveled off at 32,000 feet. The horizon sharpened into a hard blue blade. He nudged the throttle again. The needle twitched, hesitated, then sprinted. 510 EUP, 540 mph, 560 mph. The jet wasn't flying like a 1940s aircraft. It was flying like something smuggled out of 1955. Wind roared over the fuselage in a violent, shredding scream. Every seam he'd welded himself groaned. Every bolt threatened mutiny. The cockpit shook hard enough to blur his vision, yet the engine behind him didn't lose rhythm. The combustion chamber he'd patched with metal no one approved held together like it had been forged for this moment. Grant felt the drag wall ahead of him, the invisible fist that normally crushed piston fighters at these altitudes. But instead of slamming into it, the jet slipped through with a bone-deep thump, like hitting a pocket of heavy air. The nose dipped, then steadied. Speed climbed again. 580 mph, 600 mph, 620 mph. No Allied aircraft had ever touched these numbers in level flight. No Luftwaffe jet had either. The Me-262 topped out far below. Even test models struggled in this air. Grant's breathing went shallow as the controls stiffened. The wings hummed, the engine howled. The entire aircraft felt less like metal and more like a living thing pushing itself beyond design, beyond regulation, beyond sanity. At 640 EUR, the jet trembled. At 650, it stabilized. At 670 mph, Grant realized something terrifying. He was flying faster than the chase planes could even attempt to catch, faster than anything on the Western Front, faster than what the U.S. War Department had publicly admitted was achievable. Up in that silver air, racing past every known limit, he whispered the only line that fit the moment. "Tell me the Luftwaffe has something like this. I dare them." The jet didn't answer. It just flew, and climbed, and accelerated like tomorrow was already here. Grant had flown aircraft on fire. He'd wrestled P-47s with jammed controls. He'd dead-sticked a battered P-40 onto a dirt road during a sandstorm. But he had never tried to land a jet going this fast. The problem wasn't the altitude. It wasn't even the engine pushing toward meltdown in the tail. It was the simple, brutal fact that no one had designed a landing procedure for a machine that wasn't supposed to exist. As he throttled back, the jet responded like a wild animal yanked off a full sprint, violently, angrily, shaking hard enough to blur his vision. Grant eased the stick, whispering to the machine, coaxing it the way a cowboy gentles a half-broken Mustang. The engine temperature spiked, pressure surged. Every gauge danced in red. He muttered, teeth clenched, "Easy, easy now." On the ground, the test crew had already cleared the runway and dove into trenches. Word spread that Grant was coming in hot, dead hot, and the radio chatter turned panicked. "He's way too high. He's coming in at combat speed. Someone get emergency crews ready." Grant ignored all of it. At 20,000 feet, the jet didn't want to slow at all. At 15,000, it was still flying faster than P-51s flew in a dive. At 10,000, the desert blurred into a kaleidoscope of heat haze and panic. He dropped the throttle again. The engine coughed once, then roared with a sound like tearing metal. Flames licked from the exhaust. The prototype was in that razor-thin zone between control and catastrophe. Grant curled his fingers tighter on the stick. Just hold together for 3 more minutes. The aircraft hit 400 mph as it crossed the field boundary, still far too fast. Dust erupted behind him in a mile-long plume. He deployed flaps. The shock nearly tore them off. The nose pitched. The frame shuddered. Rivets pinged like bullets snapping loose. His wheels weren't down yet. Grant smashed the gear lever. The first wheel locked in place. The second hesitated, then slammed down so hard the cockpit jolted. The third didn't deploy. The ground crew screamed into the radio, "Abort! Abort! You've got a bad strut!" Grant didn't even answer. He just whispered, "We're landing anyway." At 300 mph, nearly twice safe landing speed, he hit the runway. The jet bounced once, violent enough to snap his straps. The second impact nearly tore the left wing off. Sparks exploded under the fuselage. Metal scraped the concrete like a grinding saw. The third wheel finally dropped at the last possible second, slamming down with a clang the entire airfield heard. The jet skidded, fishtailed, screamed, then rolled to a stop in a cloud of burning rubber. Silence swallowed the desert. For 5 seconds, no one moved. Smoke curled around the canopy. The engine whined down, coughing, choking, clicking like a giant metal heart shutting itself off for good. Then the cockpit popped open. Grant climbed out slowly, 1 foot on the wing, shirt drenched, hands shaking from adrenaline. He looked at the jet, at the trail of scorched runway behind it, at the stunned crew running toward him, and said the most perfectly stupid, perfectly American line anyone had ever heard after a near-fatal landing. "She'll fly again, after I fix that second-stage compressor." The ground crew stared in disbelief. The project lead fainted, and Grant, fingers still trembling, grinned like a man who had just ridden a lightning bolt back to Earth. Grant's landing should have ended the project. No test board in the country would approve a prototype that nearly welded itself to the runway and blew half its compressor doing it. Any sane committee would have stamped the program terminated in red ink and buried it under a mountain of paperwork. But Washington didn't get a report about a failure. They got a warning and a miracle. The moment the engineering team pried the data recorder off the jet's backbone, the numbers started doing something no numbers had any right to do. Airspeed curves didn't match the aircraft's design. Temperature tolerances exceeded theoretical limits. The engine's pressure ratios hinted, quietly, terrifyingly, that the prototype had crossed beyond the performance envelope of every Allied aircraft. One line in the data readout stunned the analysts into silence. Mach 1.02, unverified. It shouldn't have been possible. The U.S. didn't have a fighter anywhere near the sound barrier. Germany didn't either, not reliably, not controllably. But Grant had done it with a machine built by a handful of mechanics, a borrowed engine, and one man's refusal to play by the rules. The report reached the Pentagon in a locked steel case. Inside were three things: the flight data, raw and unedited. Grant's handwritten note: engine needs a hotter ignition cycle and better airflow. See page 4. A recommendation from the lead engineer: if we do not pursue this design, the enemy will, if they haven't already. The generals read it, then read it again, then called an emergency meeting. For 12 hours, in a room where the air smelled like burned coffee and panic, America's top brass debated. Had the test equipment glitched? Was Grant lying? Could one mechanic have stumbled into the blueprint for the first practical supersonic fighter? What would happen if Germany got there first? But the argument ended when a quiet intelligence officer placed a folder on the table and said, "Berlin just tested a high-speed prototype at Peenemünde. Their numbers are rising." The room went dead silent. That was the moment the report stopped being a document and became a spark. Funding was approved. Classified. Immediate. Every expert from Wright Field to Lockheed was yanked into the program. Engine chiefs who had laughed at Grant's modifications were now studying them like sacred scripture. A private directive circulated among senior engineers: build the machine, follow the data, do not ask where the design came from. Washington didn't want controversy. It didn't want to explain why the breakthrough had come from an unauthorized test, a forbidden modification, and a mechanic who had broken every regulation on the books. History might have given credit to generals or scientists, but the men in that room knew the truth. A single airman, working alone in a hangar at 2 a.m., had just shoved American aviation 10 years into the future, and they were going to run with it. As the meeting adjourned, a final comment echoed through the room, spoken by a general who rarely joked. "If this thing really broke the sound barrier, we better hope the kid who built it doesn't ask for royalties." The race was on, secret, urgent, and now unstoppable.